Welcome to the Seed Your Head podcast, a co-production of Seed Cannabis Market and Core Cannabis Museum, where we dig deep and explore all things cannabis. In each episode, we'll plant seeds of knowledge and cultivate a deeper understanding of cannabis. And along the way, we'll have some fun. In this episode, April talks with Liam O'Brien, Chief Marketing Officer and co-founder of Fernway, a popular Massachusetts-based cannabis product manufacturer. Get ready to demystify the process of extraction and grasp common terminology like full spectrum, resin, rosin, and more.
Welcome to the Seed Your Head podcast. We are so honored to have you here. So I want to just start with tell me who you are and who your company is, and we'll go from there. We have a lot of really interesting things to discuss today.
Sure. So I'm Liam O'Brien, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer and one of the co-founders of Fernway. Fernway is an independent product manufacturer in Massachusetts.
The first thing I want to talk about is extraction and extraction methods. We have the seed, we cultivate, now you have this plant, and you've got to get it into your vape cartridges. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and there's a lot of confusion around it.
I think it's probably helpful to start with a quick and dirty history of cannabis extraction. Extraction is taking a particular object, whether it's a organic plant or some sort of material, and you're taking out the things that you want and leaving the things that you don't want. And so when it comes to cannabis, cannabis is an organic plant and it has been used and consumed for centuries. And the earliest method of extraction was hash making, was using ice water or using a dry sift bag to be able to extract the trichomes from the plant's flowers. And it wasn't taking the oil out of the trichomes. It wasn't using a chemical process. It was really a physical one. But that was a way for people to be able to take flour and turn it into something more concentrated, more potent, which they used to make hash. It's something that we as Americans sometimes forget, but that's how the majority of the planet consumed cannabis historically. Physical extraction is the oldest and the most commonly used historical method for extracting the active ingredient from the cannabis plant. Now, when you get into chemical extraction, there's really simple ways to do this. Again, ones that people are most familiar with are using things like oil or butter to be able to extract the compounds from cannabis. And the reason why this works is because oil and butter are both fats. THC is a fat-soluble molecule. And so if you immerse cannabis flower in fat and then you heat it up to a certain point where the fat is able to dissolve the active compounds, you'll end up taking out the extracted plant material and you've got can of butter or can of oil, or in the case of, I think in Tibet, they use milk to be able to extract cannabis. And this is, again, it's usually a way to be able to create edibles because these are consumable fats that people use. But again, that's one of the earliest and most common and more recognized ways of extraction. And for people out there who are like, oh, extraction requires big steel tanks and specialized equipment. No, people have been doing it at home when they make special brownies.
Yeah, and there's all these funny tools I see advertised, like these cannabis extraction devices to make can of butter and do all these things, and it's a crock pot.
Yeah, exactly. I will say, shout out to one. This is not a plug. I am not being paid to say this, but there is this machine called Levo. It's really good for extraction because it is a crock pot, but it's just got a couple little automation steps, which means that there's a little bit less mess and cleanup, which if you're trying to get high in a hurry.
And especially that mess and cleanup, that quality you're talking about, that lipophilic characteristic, that says lipo means fat and philic means love. That characteristic makes it very hard to clean up.
Very annoying.
If you try to wash your utensils or anything that you've used, use coconut oil because it's not going to come out.
Yes. All right. Moving on to more modern methods of extraction. Right. The ones that people I'd say in the cannabis industry are most aware of are really there's three methods of chemical extraction and then one method of physical extraction. The three chemical methods are hydrocarbons. So that's gases and substances like butane, propane, heptane, carbon dioxide or CO2, and then ethanol. And those are the three solvents that are used to create most cannabis products that are available in the legal marketplace. There's a fourth method, which is mechanical, which is what's used to create rosin. And that's using just heat and pressure to be able to extract the oil from the glandular trichomes that dot the plant. When you are using hydrocarbons like butane, heptane, propane, this was one of the earlier modern methods of extraction. And this made a lot of headlines because people were doing it in really unsafe, untested, unregulated ways. And they were setting their houses on fire. They were blowing themselves up. And that is very much not something that I recommend. You can go on the CCC's website. They've got all of these guidelines and recommendations for how to not blow yourself up if you're trying to extract. But the good news is that really what has happened in the last decade is that there's been a pretty big advance in extraction technology, which allows for what's called closed loop systems. And closed loop systems are very safe. They're very well engineered. And what they do is they basically take the cannabis flower and you pack it into a metal cylinder. And then the extraction solvent, butane or heptane or whatever, then runs through the plant and dissolves the cannabinoids and the terpenes, the things that you want, but it doesn't dissolve the rest of the plant material, the chlorophyll, the various cellulose, the various other materials that you don't want to be putting into an extract. And then that extract gets pulled out of the plant and it gets post-processed to remove any residual impurities. And then you end up with an extract that is pure cannabinoids, terpenes, all the good stuff. And it's a pretty similar process with ethanol and with CO2. CO2 is actually a pre-existing extraction method. People use it to make decaffeinated coffee. So it's been around for quite a while. And the appeals of CO2 are that you're not working with a flammable or volatile chemical like heptane or butane. So some people think it's more safe. And it also is, it's more what they call tunable, which means you can change the parameters of the machine and you can pull out this, you can pull out this compound or that compound, leave this or that. And so it's a little bit like the difference between Mac and Windows. If you're someone who really wants to get under the hood and try everything out and switch every setting, CO2 is a really good extraction solvent for you. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more plug and play, then ethanol is probably the best solvent because with ethanol, it is going to pull out everything. It's very good at dissolving stuff, which does mean that you need to post-process it. You got to filter it. You got to get the ethanol out. You got to get all the other stuff out. But there's been, again, really great advances in extraction tech where if you end up with a extraction machine that uses ethanol, they've got ones that chill it down to like -50 degrees. So it's only really pulling out the stuff that you want and doesn't require that much post-processing. And a lot of the substances, a lot of the products that are made with distillate tend to use ethanol because it's just really good at pulling out THC that you can then distill down and use for your edibles, for your tinctures, for your topicals.
I just want to mention a couple things on that. Tons of good information. I just want to mention in regards to all the organic solvents, heptane, butane, these are not novel ways to extract compounds from plants. We use these methods to extract compounds from plants for pharmaceuticals, for botanicals, for a lot of things. And what the real problem is, and this is part of the exhibition up in Maine, is to talk about the evolution of vapes and where we've come. The real problem was making them an environment that was not safe so that they are blowing people up and blowing up garages, but also not removing the residual solvent. So you would have a product, a vape, that they didn't remove all of the butane. They didn't remove all of the propane, all of the hexanes, or even the ethanol. So that was a really important critical step. And prior to testing, when testing wasn't required out West, you had a lot of products and also black market products that still had these solvents in them. And that contributed to some of the fear mongering around vapes.
Absolutely. And
back in the day.
Yeah. And I think it's a really good point because if you're talking about the other compounds, non-cannabis compounds that use these processes, essential oils, extracts like vanilla and mint extract, those are all made by companies that operate under nationwide regulations that talk about what you can and can't do, how much you can and can't leave in a product in order to make it saleable. There's very stringent quality control regulations around food manufacturing, but those quality restrictions and regulations do not exist in the unlicensed market. And in some new cannabis markets, they're still being discovered and developed by the regulators. So I think that if anything, it's a great thing to see cannabis manufacturers.
Exactly. So we have the organic solvents.
Yes.
We have the CO2 extraction method, which you discussed. What I say often now about a CO2 extractor is you can buy a violin, but that doesn't mean you can play it.
Yeah. It's not a plug and play solution. Now, there have been advances in CO2 extractors specifically because of the demand from cannabis companies to have a more turnkey solution. With CO2, you still have to go through a secondary post-processing step. Certainly, if you're looking to create a product, it may not necessarily be CO2 that you want to use to create that product. But firmly, we've always internalized this idea that you start with the product you want to make and you move backwards from that.
As we just discussed the extraction method, we can talk about what it produces. When you try to Google what is in a vape or what is distillate, what is live rosin, what's resin versus rosin, these are all very complicated. Can you give us an example of what you would use a CO2 extractor for,
Sure.
what you would use organic solvent extractor for in terms of wanting to create a particular product.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You
So
know?
the first one to talk about is one that I think is most widely used in manufacturing. And it's one that a lot of people who shop for cannabis have probably heard about. It's called distillate. And distillate is a product of distillation. Distillation is a pretty common manufacturing process. You use it to create things like alcohol and other sort of refined liquids that are sold commercially. And what you do with a distillation machine and cannabis oil is you feed in raw cannabis oil and you distill out all of the compounds other than the THC. And THC is the most widely known compound in cannabis. It's the one that is most prevalent in most commercially grown cannabis strains. And so distillate is a way of taking cannabis oil and making it almost pure THC. And that's really helpful if you're making edibles because it creates really consistent dosage per batch and per piece. And it's also very popular when you use it in vape cartridges because, again, it's very potent. So you don't need to take more than like a couple hits to get where you're at.
Okay. And interestingly, I come from a biotech background, and distillate in some capacities, like among our clients here, is almost like a bad word because it's isolated THC.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence behind the entourage effect and how you need all the different compounds that are present in the plant. But from a pharmaceutical aspect, that's the
common.
standard.
Yeah.
That's what you want, an isolated compound that you can then test in different ways. And like you said, utilize in edibles and have consistency.
You bring up a good point, which is that there is a growing demand in cannabis consumer circles for something that is perceived as less processed, more quote unquote whole plant. So that's where we get into talking about things like resin and rosin and live resin. Resin is a bit of a catch-all term. If you've ever been a smoker and you've had like a really ash encrusted bowl, you've dealt with resin before. It's the residue that you get on the inside of the bowl or the pipe when you've finished smoking.
So I immediately flash back.
Yep.
And I think we all do, to my college dorm when you can't find the guy and everybody brings their bowls into the room and their bongs and you're just scraping. And then you smoke something that tastes terrible.
My lungs are hurting just thinking about it. But look, even though that is a gross and commonly shared experience, I think for a lot of people, including myself, maybe their first introduction to a cannabis concentrate. It's not a very clean or pleasant concentrate, but it is a concentrate.
Also stinks up the dorm room terribly.
Yes.
The old paper towel roll dryer sheet trick does not work.
Yeah, but you know what? I had to be resourceful in college. We all had to be resourceful. Right. There's nothing to be ashamed of about having smoked resin once, twice, or maybe even more than that in your life.
It's a badge of honor.
Yes, exactly. Now, the thing that gets confusing about a lot of this terminology is that it's not, again, being defined by any central authority. There's no USDA that's defining what prime and choice is for meat. There's no equivalent of that for cannabis. A lot of these terms come up via just mass culture, or they come up via the unlicensed market. And there can be some confusing overlap between some of the terms. Live resin is a good example of that. The most basic definition of it is that it refers to a cannabis extract that is using fresh frozen cannabis plant material as a input, as a manufacturing input. So you take the plant, you harvest it, and you immediately throw it in a freezer so that it is preserved with the same flavor profile and the same cannabinoid profile that was in the plant when it was growing in the field or in the grow room. And then the reason why people do that is because it preserves that flavor and it preserves those compounds that otherwise might degrade or evaporate once the cannabis is being cured. And the live resin that is made from that uses a butane extraction process to be able to create what for a lot of people they find to be a more enjoyable experience because it has more flavor. It's got more of those minor cannabinoid compounds other than THC. So the high is different from if you were just consuming THC. And it's become more popular because a lot of people really enjoy it as a step up from your standard extract that's been refined. And got to put in a plug here. Fernway dropped our live resin line and got a nice poster about it here in the seed dispensary. It's one of those things that didn't become popular until really the last 4 or 5 years. It's a bit of a small batch process. It takes a while to make. You're using these fresh frozen plants. You got to keep them frozen. It requires a lot of power. So it's one of those products that only becomes really widely available once a market has been around for a couple of years.
And just to explain the importance of flash freezing, trichomes are this really amazing structure on the plant. They're the sparkly, glittering, translucent, juicy little mushroom-looking things that dot the cannabis plant, the bud. But what happens in the drying and the curing process is they're withering, and that's what's leading to all of that decay. So they're basically harvesting and immediately flash freezing. So from the moment you flash frozen to the time when you have the product, what is the time frame?
It can depend. You can keep these plants in
Flash
this
frozen
in this
indefinitely.
state of
Yeah.
suspended animation effectively for months. But for the most part, what most people, including myself, really like about live resin is the taste of freshness
Yeah.
and the idea that you are consuming something that has not been the equivalent of sitting under the heat lamp at the buffet table. I will say that there's plenty of people out there who like live resin, but they feel like the flavor that comes from a cured product is more interesting because even though you're right, some of those compounds in the trichomes evaporate over time, sometimes they also combine with each other and they change, especially the terpenes. And so there are some people who really prefer a cured resin to a live resin, but it really just comes down to your personal preference.
Okay. So now to add insult to injury, we have resin and rosin.
Yes. Oh, man. I grew up in a house where my mom was and still is a violin teacher. And so when I was a kid, rosin was that sticky stuff that you put on your violin bow to
Yes.
make sure that you could effectively draw it across the strings. And it was the pine sap from a pine tree that they would compress into a block and sell at music stores. But when I entered the cannabis space, I started hearing about rosin. And what rosin is, it's not pine tar, and it's not the same thing as resin. What it is it refers to the oils that have been extracted from cannabis that has been basically put through a process that uses heat and pressure to squish all of the oil out of those trichomes. So you take, whether it's some really nice flower nugs or you take all the trichomes off that flower and you make hash, you then put that into a cheesecloth bag, and then this metal plate comes down that's very hot and it presses it flat. And as it does that, all those little trichomes pop and the oil starts to ooze out, and it ends up collecting on usually a piece of parchment paper. And then you scrape it off the parchment paper and you have the same stuff that you would get if you were using butane or CO2, but without any of the post-processing. And what a lot of people like about the product that comes out, that rosin, is similar to what they like about live resin. It feels to them, it's fresher. It tastes more complex. It's almost like the difference between Jack Daniels and single malt scotch. What you have is a product that's much more connoisseur. It's much more small batch, but becoming increasingly popular because there's more people who are producing it and people who are interested in that next interesting thing.
I have a juicer. It has a hydraulic press. It's not heated. What is the plant material like when it's going into that? Is that also flash frozen? Is it fresh?
It's a good question. There is a version of rosin which uses flash frozen material, and that's live rosin. So live, when you're talking about an extract, always refers to flash frozen.
Okay.
Exactly. It means that it was a fresh plant that was either flash frozen, or in some cases, people harvest the plant wet and they just throw it right into the extractor, no freezing involved. And that's actually how Fernway has terpenes that we use for our strain collection cartridges. And those terpenes are actually harvested fresh from the plant. The plant has not been frozen. It's just been pulled off the stalk, and an hour later, terpenes get pulled off, and that's what we put into our strain collections. There's a number of different ways to treat fresh material, but when you're talking about extracts, live generally equals you're using fresh frozen material.
When you're pulling off the terpenes from a live plant that you've just cut, what method are you using?
So I'll be transparent. We don't pull the terpenes off ourselves. We work with a manufacturing partner who's harvesting the bud actually out in California.
Okay.
So what they do is they use giant steam distillation ones. And what that is a pretty, honestly, old-fashioned way of pulling flavor molecules off of plants. It's how they make perfume, for example. And so what you're able to do is very gently extract the flavor molecules rather than flooding them with a harsh solvent that pulls it off that you then go through post-processing. And that, I think, is what creates a much more true to the plant flavor profile, because the actual molecules are not being pulled apart every which way and bashed around against the sides of
And that's something that people want, like just knowing what customers are coming in and asking for, plant-derived terpenes. So it's great that you guys are.
Yeah, Fernway, we really focus on flavor, and terpenes are what provide all types of material with their flavor, whether it's flowers or hops or oranges or pine needles and cannabis. And then we've got our live resin line, and that's not only using live cannabis terpenes, but it's also an extract that hasn't been distilled. So you have this sort of full range of psychoactive compounds in it. And each product line appeals to a different kind of person. And within that product line, there's different strains, different flavors. But what we really pride ourselves on is quality control and consistency above all else.
I know the concentration is on flavor, but I try to tell people all the time, don't sleep on terpenes when it comes to how it makes you feel.
Yeah.
We have a terpene wall here, which I know you've interacted with, where the wall is loaded with different terpenes.
It's super cool. If you haven't gone to see it yet, come to Jamaica Plain and check out the terpene.
Thank you so much. And I try to analogize it to aromatherapy. If you are wanting to relax, you take a lavender bath. If you are wanting to do your homework, you burn a pine candle. So all these things have impacts and they interact, some of them directly with your endocannabinoid system. Okay, so we were just talking a little bit about terpenes. Yeah. So I think one of the other popularly searched terms is, what is full spectrum?
It is a very popular question. And the frustrating thing is that there is no one single answer. What I generally tell people is that full spectrum refers to an extract that has not been distilled or refined. And so what that means is that it has a full or fuller spectrum of compounds that are captured in it. So when you're talking about cannabis, the active ingredient most people know about is THC. That's a cannabinoid. There are other cannabinoids in the plant that are, CBD is one that is also very well known, but there's ones that are present in small amounts in most commercially available cannabis, but that still affect the human response to it. Things like CBG, THCV, CBN, these are CBC, I think is one. And these are all tiny little percentages, but at the same time, they do affect the human endocannabinoid system. You consume them, they will have an effect. So THC has an effect. It won't have the same effect as THC, and it's not in the same concentration, but more people are starting to realize that cannabis is not just a synonym for THC. And as a result, they look for extracts or strains that have more of these other compounds. Now, there's cannabinoids, there's also terpenes. Terpenes are really, I would say, the hot topic in cannabis these days. And they are the molecules, as I said earlier, that are present in all types of plants, and they are what you are smelling when you smell cannabis. That's the terpenes evaporating off the plant, and that's what is hitting your nose and hitting your blood-brain barrier. And if you've ever, for example, gone into a grocery store and you've walked down the cleaning aisle, you smell all of that wonderful lemon scent, and that's probably limonene, which is a very common terpene that you find in lemon peels and other citruses, and also in cannabis. So why do people care about terpenes? Because you want your weed to smell good and taste good. I think that's something we can all agree on. But also because there's increasing research and anecdotal evidence, the terpenes that are present in a particular strain have an impact on the experience of people who consume that strain. And because cannabis is still federally illegal, there's still a pretty big deficit of research on exactly what terpenes do what and in what ratios and what other variables affect someone's experience. But what we do know is there's a lot of evidence that people respond to different terpene profiles, and that affects their high in the same way that a different cannabinoid profile would. And what is really exciting about being on the commercial side of things is that you get to help people graduate from one product form to another. And when they're saying, I want to try something new, you can introduce them to this idea that, there's not just one kind of weed. There's not just one kind of cannabis. It's not just all high THC, low CBD kind of stuff that you would get when you were in the bad old days, when you were a teenager. There's some really interesting science, and there's some really interesting products that are being made to try to emphasize those compounds and to have more flavor. And for a lot of people, a more rich, interesting high as a result of that flavor.
So full spectrum is less of a type of product and more of a descriptive.
Yeah.
It's a descriptive of things like live resin.
Yeah. Or rosin.
Live rosin. Yeah.
Technically, like people have been smoking full spectrum compounds when they've been smoking cannabis with the whole grain.
Yeah.
Popcorn is a whole grain because you're eating the entire thing. You're not removing any of it. Similar with cannabis.
I love that.
Yeah. You're getting the whole experience.
Whole grain cannabis. Somebody should trademark that if you could. But then the other part of this, I don't think you can talk about. So full spectrum to me immediately is the entourage effect, right? Which is this theory that has been pushed. I think Meshulam started it, but basically that we need all the compounds, not only the cannabinoids and the trace cannabinoids and the terpenes, but also the flavonoids and the other groups of compounds that are in the cannabis plant. We may be formulating it and adding all the things that we think are important, that we think your body's interacting with, but we don't know that trace element or that trace compound that is really enhancing your feeling or your euphoria in a certain way.
It's important as any cannabis consumer to have an open mind and to say, for example, if you are feeling bored with the product or the strain that you've always enjoyed, maybe you're starting to look for something new, that there's new stuff out there and that it's available at stores like Seed, and it's available for you to be able to try out, not because no one should feel forced to move off the things that work for them. And if you're someone, for example, who really likes high THC strains and they get you where you want to get to, that's totally fine. But if you're looking for something else, the great thing is there's more options than there used to be. And I know this is something that you go into in the museum here, but the reason why so many commercially available strains are high in THC is because prohibition really incentivized the cultivation of high THC strains and the breeding out of those other cannabinoids over many decades, because that was the product that would sell the fastest and would get the highest markup in the unlicensed market. And when you're operating under prohibition and you have to be able to hide your production and your distribution from law enforcement authorities, you don't want to be spending extra time and take on extra risk creating a craft product that might not sell that well. And the great thing about legalization and regulation is it gives extra bandwidth and breathing room in the marketplace to create new kinds of products and serve needs more.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's said. I don't even have anything to add.
There's more innovation, which I think is always good for anybody. And if you're someone out there I don't have any idea where to start, best thing you can do is go down to your local dispensary if you have one near you and talk to your bud tender, because that's someone who has tried almost all the products on the menu and really prides themselves on having that specialized knowledge. And you can go to Google, you can talk to your friend who's knowledgeable, do whatever you want to do. But if you've got access to a bud tender, they're worth their weight in gold.
Oh yeah. Our guys have tried everything.
Exactly.
We have most of our customers come in and what should I get? And everybody knows. But I have a couple of questions that I'd like to hear your take on.
Hit me.
What frustrates you most about the cannabis industry?
It's a bit of a catch-all, but I would say that the thing that frustrates me the most is when I'm confronted with the aspects of the industry that are still really underdeveloped and unsophisticated. And by that, I've worked in industries that are much more developed, that have been in operation for decades, if not centuries. And what that means is that there's a lot of best practices and there's a lot of institutions and ideas that help people do their job and to be able to produce the best quality product. And there's not a lot of guesswork. That can be both good. It can be bad in that it means there's gatekeeping and it means that there's really strict ways of doing things and it can stifle innovation. But when it comes to cannabis, what that means is that there's just aspects of operating as an industry that we don't have access to. It comes to things like conventional banking, conventional business services, it comes to payment processing, it comes to all of these things that every other small business has access to. By virtue of where we operate, we just aren't able to access them. And because of that, there's a lot of, I think, extra work and extra brain damage that needs to go into any normal business process. And that has changed a great deal over the last few years. And there's more and more opportunities to bring cannabis into a place as an industry where you're not doing it, you're not reinventing the wheel every time. But I would say that even though that is the case and it's not as bad as it used to be, I'm still confronted on a daily basis by just something where I'm like, if this was an industry that had been around for 50 years in the current form that it is, this wouldn't be an issue. And I think that as an entrepreneur is something that is really top of mind. And it's something that I have to remain patient about because progress is coming and it continues to come. But I sometimes have to explain to people from outside the industry, you think you understand how it works, but all of these fundamentals are different. It's like working on if you're someone who knows how to use the most sophisticated computing technology is available in 2023 and you're trying to do your job on a Microsoft Windows machine from 1988.
No,
and
totally.
It's tough and it's something that I have to constantly confront and that I have to also remind my team we're making progress as an industry, but some of these things we just have to grin and bear it.
Yeah, and imagine what we could do if we could put all of that brain power on the things that really matter. It always reminds me of, imagine if we were able to focus on clean energy or flying cars or happiness in a fraction of the amount we focus on the military. Imagine all the things we could have already figured out. We would be to Mars and back already. Okay, What piece of misinformation do you feel is most damaging in regards to cannabis?
I think that the piece of information that is the most damaging is probably still that the plant constitutes a unique danger that necessitates prohibition and incarceration. It's still the case in a lot of places all around the country, no matter how much progress has been made on medical and adult use legalization. But I think that's a pretty easy answer. And I think that really what is worse than that is not necessarily the misinformation, but the willingness of people with big platforms and media outlets to spread that misinformation. The idea that opening up a dispensary is going to lead to falling property rates in the neighborhood, or, oh, this isn't your grandpa's weed. What they sell now is just way more potent than ever. These are ideas that have been presented over and over again, and they're just straight up untrue. The idea that modern cannabis is exponentially more potent than anything that's ever been consumed before. I go back to what I was saying earlier. Most people throughout history have consumed cannabis by consuming hash. Hash is way more potent than commercial grade cannabis because it's concentrated. And the idea that, 25%, 30% THC bud is suddenly, going to be this like alien substance that people are consuming, it's straight up not true, but it sounds true to the uneducated. And I think media outlets have a responsibility to be critical, of course, of any common wisdom, but also to present.
Yeah, I mean, it's clickbait culture, which is totally maddening. I've had major news outlets that are supposed to be reputable come in, especially when we were first opening, and cover the museum. And it was very clear to me that before they arrived, they had written the title for the piece.
Yeah, probably had a weed pun in it.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it was it's exhausting. And I think it's a universal
It is, but
gripe.
it goes back to my first gripe, which is that the industry is underdeveloped and the coverage of it is underdeveloped.
Yeah.
I think the more that it grows, the more that it becomes acceptable, and the more that media outlets realize that there is a demand for nuanced reporting here and not just like dumb weed puns and uncritically reprinting reactionaries, there will be a change. There already has been. There are really good outlets out there. I'd say that Leafly does great reporting. The Globe has done some great reporting. There's an outlet out of Syracuse that's reporting on the New York market called New York Cannabis Insider. I read them every morning.
Nice.
And there's great outlets and reporters out there, but they're just unfortunately not the norm yet.
Yeah, not getting the airtime. Okay, how do you feel about Delta 8 or hemp-derived Delta 8 or 10?
For the folks who are listening who don't know about Delta 8 or Delta 0, I think is one of the other ones. These are cannabinoids that are either produced through a chemical process that turns CBD into what's called an isomer, which is like a variant of THC. It's mostly reported as having weaker effects than THC, but because it can be produced from CBD, which is very cheap and easy to get, it's something that people are producing at large scale and selling as commercial products for ingestion. The issue is similar, though, to the same thing that happened with CBD, which is that it was more widely available commercially than it was researched and studied. And it was also more widely available than it was regulated. So whether the purity of the extract that you were using or process that was used to make it, there was no transparency into that. So when you go, for example, to a smoke shop or a gas station, Delta 8 cartridges, it might get you high. I've smoked Delta 8 cartridges. I don't find them that. I prefer Delta 9 THC, if I'm being honest. But ultimately, the thing that I find really troubling about the proliferation of Delta 8 products is that it's the same thing that happened with CBD. There was just a lot of commerce and not a lot of oversight and not a lot of transparency into who was making it, what was in it. And when that happens, you don't know what is in that product. You can't trust what's on the label. You can't trust what the person is telling you because they have no reason to give you the truth and they may not even have it. And that to me it's the same thing that I say about unlicensed cannabis vape cartridges of all kinds. If you're not getting it in a licensed, regulated retailer, then you do not know where it came from, and you should not be putting it into your body unless you are willing to take on a degree of risk that I think most people who see this stuff available at gas stations, they don't know there's risk involved. And so I would just say that it's something that troubles me, not because of the inherent product itself, which I could take or leave, but because it's not being produced in a way that is going to lead to optimal public health.
Totally agree. And just because he is very smart. An isomer of the compound it's the same chemical component, but the shape of the molecule is different. So essentially in Delta 8 and Delta 10, they're just moving around where the double carbon bond is. But it reminds me of the early days when I was working a lot with the Canna moms, and I would go to different states and they would come up to me with a bag of sticky, unlabeled things and be like, this is what I have. What do I give to my child? Yeah. And not even talking about potency and dose. It was just a question of testing these things and finding that if you have a warehouse full of hemp, chances are they have rat poison around that warehouse. And when you concentrate compounds out of that hemp product, you now have concentrated arsenic in your product. And it's the components that are coming along with it that are more concerning to me than the actual compounds themselves, like you said.
Yeah, these products aren't being tested under any sort of regime that has been decided through a government or an institution. And I think that the other thing that is worth mentioning is that the only reason why these products are proliferating is because Delta-9 THC is illegal. And so what that means is that they want to service the demand, so we're give them something that we're going to we can't sell Delta-9, so we are going to sell Delta-8 because Delta-8 is not technically illegal. It occupies this gray zone. I think what that means is that it's really short-term thinking, and it also is a reminder that this is what happens when you prohibit a substance that is consumed widely all over the planet and that we have seen is way less harmful than alcohol, way less harmful than cigarettes, way less harmful than a lot of other quote-unquote vices, and also incredibly beneficial medicinally to a lot of people. And when you ban that, you don't end up with a better system. You end up with bad actors who are going to exploit every single part of that system to be able to make a profit. And that doesn't mean that everyone who's in the unlicensed market is evil or malicious. It's a structural issue. If you have a structure that doesn't allow for clean, regulated product to be distributed through channels that people can access, then you cannot be surprised when actors take advantage of that system.
Absolutely. And I'm going to do a whole episode on Delta-8. There's a really interesting Ninth Circuit case that I want to get into and all that good stuff. So
it's very much a rip from the headlines thing because there's states right now that are moving to Delta-8 illegal.
8 of them already have.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I think that this is all happening because there is this ridiculous federal law that differentiates between cannabis and hemp, which in turn has created all of these different little sub-industries that would not exist if it was simply regulated sensibly.
This has been awesome.
Thank
you are
you.
an amazing guest.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Fernway.
Fernway.com.
Seed Your Head podcast is a production of Seed Cannabis Market and Core Cannabis Museum. You can find episode transcripts, bonus content, and more at our website, seedyourhead.com. We'd also love to see you in person at our locations in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, and Portland, Maine. Core Cannabis Museum is a nonprofit 501c3, and all donations are tax deductible. For more information on donations or sponsorship, please check out our website.